Hello, everybody. This is Jake Wynn from the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, coming at you this evening for another one of our live programs through our Facebook Live on our Facebook page. I'm joined tonight by Kevin Pawlak, friend of the museum and historian extraordinaire. How are you doing tonight, Kevin?
Doing well, Jake. How about yourself?
Doing well. Adjusting to this incredible heat wave that we are having in the DC vicinity. I know that you're probably experiencing that over in Virginia as well.
It's been brutal. Yeah, waiting for some rain.
Yep, same here. I got the AC pumping. It is not working. It is very warm in this room at the moment, but we're dealing with it. And thank you all so much for joining us. I see we have some folks joining on. We have about a dozen people here so far. I know some more folks will be jumping in as well. This evening, excited to be talking about, on the eve of the anniversary of this battle, medical care at the Battle of First Manassas, or First Bull Run, depending on your persuasion. And we're going to be talking about how this battle really shapes medical care for the rest of the war. It's going to teach some pretty brutal lessons about what the Civil War is going to be like. It is going to show that this is not going to be an easy conflict with little consequence. This is going to be a bloody war. And this first major land battle of the war in July of 1861 is going to show just how terrible this Civil War is going to be. It's going to be a preview of the bloodshed that is going to come. That's what we are going to be talking about this evening, a conversation between myself and Kevin. Before we jump into that, I do want to go through our usual introduction here for the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. If you are enjoying these videos, we've been doing them since March, since the pandemic began. You can help to support us. You can go and click like on this video. You can share this video with your friends and family. Put it on your own Facebook page. That allows more people to join into the conversation. And that's a really important part of these videos, is we want it to be a conversation. This isn't just going to be a conversation between myself and Kevin, but it's also going to include some of the things in the comment section as well. So if you have a question you'd like to ask, a point you'd like to make, you want to let us know where you're watching from, jump over into the comment section. Let us know where you're watching from. Let us know what you think about the conversation. And most importantly, if you have any questions at all for us, feel free to jump into the comment section and we will integrate that right into our program this evening. We'll also do a bit of a Q&A session at the end before we sign off as well. If you want to take your support to the next level for the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, you can become a member of our institution. Up until recently, we had our doors closed to the public due to the pandemic. We have recently reopened, which is really exciting, but we're still asking for, if you have an interest in Civil War medicine, Civil War history, become a member of the museum. You get a bunch of great perks. You get a subscription to our annual, multiple times a year, journal that comes out with some of the latest scholarship on Civil War medicine. You can also know that you are supporting our institution and sharing the stories of Civil War medical care. So if you want to do that, you can jump over to the comment section. I'll be dropping a link to that in the comment section very shortly. So this evening's conversation is with Kevin Pawlak. Kevin, can you introduce yourself to our audience? Tell us a little bit about who you are.
Sure. Currently, the hat that I am wearing right now is as Historic Site Manager with the Prince William County Historic Preservation Division. We're part of the Department of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism. And I have the pleasure to manage both Ben Lomond Historic Site, which I know we'll bring up in conversation quite a bit tonight, and then also Bristow Station Battlefield Heritage Park. But graduated from Shepherd University, so not too far down the road from the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. And done a little bit of digging myself into the role of Civil War medicine, specifically the Confederate Medical Corps during the Maryland campaign in 1862.
Excellent. So Ben Lomond is a pretty amazing place, very close to the Manassas National Military Park, National Battlefield. Can you tell us a little bit about Ben Lomond? And I know we're going to be talking about that site a bit later this evening, but can you introduce our viewers to that museum?
Yeah, absolutely. So Ben Lomond Historic Site, as Jake said, is located in suburban Manassas, about 1.5 miles, 2 miles due south of the Visitor Center on Henry Hill at Manassas National Battlefield Park. So we have 5 different historic buildings on site, about 6 acres. as well as a historic roadbed that Confederate troops utilized on their way to Henry Hill during the Battle of First Manassas. But we have the main house, which was constructed in 1832, a smokehouse, a dairy, one of only 3 surviving original slave quarters still standing in Prince William County, and then a late 19th century, early 20th century farmhouse. But the main house itself was built in 1832 by Benjamin Tasker Chin. For those of you familiar with Manassas battlefield, you might hear the name Chin spoken of in association with, of course, Chin Ridge during First and Second battles of Manassas. But while we have many different stories that we tell at the site, again, including utilizing the historic slave quarters that we have there, because it is, again, one of the few original buildings of that kind in Prince William County, and certainly an incredible story to tell. We have converted really the inside of the house to what it might have looked like on the night of July 21st, 1861. And it's still, every day I go in there and give tours to people. It's a fascinating, unique experience. We have all sorts of visuals and interactives for folks to really get a sense of what a Civil War hospital was like. And that includes sights, sounds that we have throughout the house, and smells, both good and bad, of just trying to give you a little bit of a sample of what Civil War hospitals might have smelled like. And of course, we can only try to replicate that, and just give folks an idea of just how gruesome a place like that could be in the aftermath of a battle.
Yeah, I've been to many Civil War hospital sites over the years in working for the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. I think the most visceral and most real is a visit to Ben Lomond. If you go there, you really are surrounded by, and you go and visit, you can sense the history, you can taste the history, smell the history, touch the history, although as we were saying before we jumped on, touching the history during the pandemic is a little more difficult, but it's an amazing place where you can experience and you can see what these Civil War soldiers would have faced in these hospitals, what the reality would have been like. What was the situation like at Ben Lomond? You know, I think this is a good jumping off place for us. What was the situation like at Ben Lomond during the Battle of First Manassas?
Yeah, so it was about roughly 1,000-acre plantation or farm. In 1861, it was still owned by the Chins, who, as I mentioned, built it about 30 years prior to the start of the American Civil War. But the Chins weren't living in it. They had actually moved up to Chin Ridge, again, on Manassas National Battlefield, hence the name. And they were renting out the house to a family of Scottish immigrants by the name of the Pringles. So they weren't actually American citizens. They were still British subjects, but were here living in the United States, renting out the farm, growing mainly things like corn, wheat, and most prominently, they had a herd of about 500 merino sheep, which are sheep that give off a lot of wool and very good wool material. So the Pringles had a store on the property as well, which would come into play in their dealings with the Union Army, especially once the Union Army occupied Prince William County beginning in the spring of 1862. But on July 21st, 1861, of course, most of the Confederate Army was positioned south of Ben Lomond along Bull Run in the area of historically Mitchell's Ford, Blackburn's Ford, which is where Route 28 crosses over Bull Run today between Prince William and Fairfax County. But of course, the plans of the generals, especially Union General Irvin McDowell, did not call for attacking that part of the Confederate line. Instead, it called for attacking the northern end of the Confederate line in the area of the Stone Bridge. And so as the battle continued to grow in intensity throughout the morning of July 21st, Confederate troops began moving north along simple farm roads, one of which was called the Rock Road, which ran and still does today. It's now just a driveway and an old roadbed, but ran past Ben Lomond, and Confederate troops utilized that on their way to the battlefield itself. So Ben Lomond is actually a Scottish term, and it means beacon mountain, roughly translated. But it's very telling because it's tough to see today because of all the development that's grown up around it. But it does sit on top of a pretty prominent hillside, and so it was a prominent landmark as Confederate troops moved up towards the battlefield. It's a big house; you can't miss it. And so for that reason, and also because it was far enough behind the battle lines, some Confederate surgeons decided that they would turn the house into a field hospital at some point on the afternoon of July 21st of 1861. And again, since it was along a major road that Confederate troops had used, it was going to be easy, they figured, to get Confederate troops back to the hospital itself to be treated for their wounds.
That's a good point about kind of the preparation in terms of they're doing it on the afternoon of the battle. They're turning it into a hospital. What can you say about, in the vicinity of Ben Lomond, maybe further back towards Manassas, some of the Confederate medical preparations for the battle?
Yeah, I think this might be a common theme for both of us, obviously, tonight. It's really cliche to say it in the Civil War world, but many people, not all, in North and South, but many people believed that it was going to be a relatively quick war, very little bloodshed. And so I think overall, both sides were completely unprepared for the amount of carnage that could be found on the plains of Manassas on July 21st of 1861. You have 900 dead between the two armies, about 2,600 wounded. And so up to that point in American history, July 21st was actually the bloodiest day in American history. And so I think while both sides struggled, I think, to remove wounded from the battlefield and to make sure that all the wounded were treated, the Confederacy, just because of the very nature of it, that this nation is only 3 months old at this point in July of 1861. It does have some experienced medical officers at the helm of Beauregard and Johnson's armies in the Manassas area. But overall, it's going to be a lot of flying by the seat of their pants, so to speak, in terms of figuring out where to remove wounded from the battlefield, where do you perform the major operations. So, for example, the 7th and 8th Georgia infantries that will fight on top of Matthews Hill in the morning's action initially established their aid station and began conducting amputations and major surgeries right behind the firing line. And of course, very quickly they realized that's probably not the best location to do that. And so while we say, and some of the surgeons at Ben Lomond that we'll talk about tonight certainly replicate this, a lot of these surgeons, they had some form of experience in terms of their medical profession before the war, but many of them had never seen the likes of what a mini ball or just any bullet could do to human flesh and bone. And I think many surgeons thus were unprepared for the amount of trauma and wounded that they were going to have to deal with on the night of July 21st.
Yeah, you mentioned it as a cliche about no one really being prepared and knowing what is coming from this battle, but it's a cliche because it's pretty true. We have a great comment here from Andrea saying about what's the quote, blood enough to fill a thimble or something. I think I've seen a handkerchief, you could wipe up the blood with a handkerchief, about these ideas that, this war is going to be so quick and bloodless that it's going to be over before anyone really knows it. And this battle belies that situation and shows that this is going to be a bloodier conflict. On the United States Army side, it's kind of the same situation. There's not a lot of preparations that are done for the Union Army. The base is, for much of the Civil War, is going to be Washington, D.C. And you can see by looking at the preparations that were made before the Manassas campaign begins, before the campaign to Bull Run begins in June and July of 1861, that there is very little forethought put into where the wounded going to be treated. Where are wounded soldiers going to be brought back? How are they going to be brought back from whatever battlefield may take place? Where are they going to be treated once they are brought back to the city? There was no real hospital facility in Washington, D.C. before the outbreak of the Civil War. There's a small hospital in the city that is filled with wounded and wounded and sick soldiers by the time most of the Union Army gets to Washington, D.C. in May of 1861. And they're quickly filling the U.S. Capitol building, the Patent Office, federal buildings, with making the makeshift hospitals. So there's very little preparation made before this battle gets started. And that is going to be kind of the start of the comedy of errors that is going to be the medical response from the federal side to what's going to happen at Manassas. I do want to bring up a photo here, and I showed Kevin this earlier, and I wanted to bring him up because he kind of looks like we were describing him as maybe a little bit of a Muppet look. This is the pull him up here. There you go. This is William Shakespeare King. He is going to be the gentleman who is going to be responsible for the medical response and medical leadership at Bull Run, at Manassas, July 21st of 1861 for the Union Army. And yeah, we're going to talk a little bit more about him. He's a bit of a character, but I do just want to bring him up so you get a visual of what this guy looks like. He looks like a Shakespearean character himself, I would have to say. Got the eyes for that look there. But this battle is going to be really a landmark in beginning the evolution of military medicine on both the Union and the Confederate side. So Kevin, I want to go back to you here and get in and dive into that Ben Lomond story. So you laid the groundwork for it in terms of what was going on, and they're establishing a hospital there in the evening of July 21st, 1861. What is the medical story that takes place at your museum?
Yeah, so the Confederate surgeons had determined that the house itself was going to be used, not just the grounds, not just the property, but the entire house. And so at some point during the proceedings of the Confederate Medical Corps establishing the hospital there at Ben Lomond, they gave the Pringle family a couple of different options, and it was either basically stay, but have your living quarters confined to one room in the house, or leave the entire house and grounds in the possession of the Confederate States Medical Corps. Also, the night of July 21st, 1861, it began to rain, thunder, and lightning. Nobody likes being out in that weather, but especially if you're holding up medical tools, you certainly don't want to be out in that kind of weather. And so everything was moved inside of the house itself. The dining room was converted into a makeshift surgery room. The parlor across the central passage from the dining room, the largest room in the house, became the recovery room. But from the sources that we have, the place was just filled with wounded soldiers. Edward Craighill was just a young 20-year-old hospital steward that had been plucked from the ranks just a few days earlier to help evacuate Confederate wounded from the battlefield. And Craighill talked about in his memoirs years after the fact how the night of July 21st, maybe very early into the morning hours of July 22nd, he was just exhausted from so many different surgical operations and running around and nursing wounded soldiers that he searched throughout the entire house for a place to just lie down and grab a few minutes of quiet and rest. And he said there is no place in the entire house for a well man to rest. And so Craighill had to go outside. He slept underneath a tree that night, remember, in the pouring rain. A Confederate soldier on either side of him, wounded, he presumed, that was waiting for medical care. But when Craighill woke up from his nap to resume his duties, he had found that both of those Confederate soldiers on either side of him had died. And he spent the rest of his life wondering if they had already been dead by the time he went out there, or if they had died during the night. But I think that's a very key point, and that just going to show how much the Confederate Medical Corps, not just at Ben Lomond, but throughout the Manassas area, was overwhelmed by the amount of wounded that they had to deal with, because they couldn't even get to every single wounded soldier before they perspired. And of course, Manassas is not unique in that. That happens at many other battles, but it really stands out this early in the war, what that was like. So overall, the hospital that was formerly known as the Pringle House Hospital in Confederate records existed from July 21st until August 25th, so about 5 weeks. The number of wounded were there. And unfortunately, we don't know how many wounded initially were there the night of July 21st, but again, with using Craighill's memoirs, we can get a sense that it was maybe at least 100, 150 Again, just a rough ballpark estimate, trying to figure out how many wounded soldiers could you cram inside of a house like that. But by the time the hospital closed in August, late August, there were only 6 patients that were remaining there.
Do y'all know about, who some of the patients were that were treated in the house?
Yes, we do. We have about close to 15 names that we've been able to positively identify that were there. It's mostly soldiers from the Stonewall Brigade, or what becomes known as the Stonewall Brigade, on July 21st. We have soldiers from the 2nd Virginia, 33rd Virginia, 4th Virginia, and 27th Virginia that we've been able to locate. A soldier from the 2nd Mississippi as well. And so the idea of establishing unit hospitals hasn't really caught on quite yet, because you just got soldiers from all over the place that are coming into this hospital. A couple of the patients that we do know quite a bit about, maybe the most well-known, excuse me, is William Fitzhugh Lee, who was Lieutenant Colonel of the 33rd Virginia Infantry. And his story is very well documented, very well recorded. He's obviously an officer, but also a member of the prominent Lee family in Virginia. And Lee was wounded approximately in the area of the parking lot today where the visitor center sits on top of Henry Hill. He received a projectile to the chest, drove a bit of one of those gold buttons into his chest, obviously a very painful wound, basically impossible for him to talk, very difficult for him to breathe. But Lee was eventually transported back to the Craighill House Hospital. He lingered there for about a week. His family, including his wife, traveled from Shepherdstown, Virginia at the time, now West Virginia today, to be down there, be with him, try to nurse him back to health. But ultimately, Lee died of gangrene. Very common, especially in early hospitals, infectious gangrene that he contracted. And so he's maybe the most prominent, but we've been trying to track down a few other of the patients that were there. And one we've recently found was Private Paul Miller of the 33rd Virginia Infantry. And the incredible thing about him is we've been able to piece his story together really from the time his unit arrives on Henry Hill to him coming back to the Craighill House Hospital, and even in the years after the war. We have an account of him being wounded. Basically, an artillery shell comes bouncing along the slope of Henry Hill, and it clips one of Paul Miller's legs, his left leg. He's transported to the rear. He actually states in his application for getting a prosthetic limb from the state of Virginia and from the Confederate government that Hunter McGuire himself amputated his leg on July 21st. And then Miller survives the war. Of course, he goes back to Page County in the Shenandoah Valley, where he lives the rest of his life until 1907. But we have some of his documentation, and he's always writing. He was a farmer, and so he was very active, and he was always writing and filling out new applications to be reimbursed for money, trying to get a new prosthetic limb. So it was really neat to put a human face to some of these patients, whereas for a lot of the guys that we know that were there, we just have this snapshot, this one snapshot of their life that we know they're at the Craighill House Hospital, and that's about all we know. But it was really neat to be able to track a guy throughout his entire life and see the medical effects of what he suffers at the Craighill House Hospital carry with him the rest of his life. So that was pretty neat.
Yeah, those are the stories that make working in the field of history really special, right? I think that's those connections that you can find. You stumble upon somebody's story and you begin to pull on those threads, and sometimes you don't find anything. You find it's just the snapshot that you have, but other times you start pulling on those threads and all of a sudden this whole story becomes clear, and you begin to learn more about who these people were. And when you begin to do that, you feel this connection, with these people, and this one dramatic event that you work with there, Kevin, at Ben Lomond, and that they experienced at that location, but then you find that, they lived a whole life before that. And in some cases, if they were lucky enough, they lived a whole life afterwards. And those are the kinds of stories that make, working in history, I find, to be just an incredible experience. So the Confederates have the benefit at Manassas, July of 1861, that they control the battlefield at the end of the day. And they're going to be able to have places like Ben Lomond where they can have soldiers who have been wounded. They can stay in that hospital for as long as is necessary. What can you say about kind of the aftermath, and how did wounded soldiers get from the battlefield back to Ben Lomond?
Yeah, it's not really indicated clearly. I've seen sources that folks, other historians writing about the supplies that the Confederate Medical Corps had, that they had plenty of wagons, they had ambulances, they had all sorts of supplies. I've seen other sources that said the Confederate Army actually had no wheeled wagons, ambulances, whatever, to utilize as ambulances during the course of the battle. And so, it kind of depends. I'm sure that they were able to take a few wagons from the local countryside and move soldiers back. But again, using the fact that we have soldiers from Virginia, we have soldiers from Mississippi, potentially some soldiers from North Carolina as well, it seems that there was no truly organized fashion of getting wounded back to the Pringle House Hospital. And what that tells me is maybe some might have been brought by wagon, but others are just walking down the road that they took to get to the battlefield. They're getting away from the battlefield, and when they stop at the Pringle House Hospital, maybe because they're just so exhausted at this point, or they know that it's a safe haven, they decide to so to speak admit themselves, if you will. So I'm sure all manner of conveyance was used to bring wounded soldiers back to the hospital, whether it was ambulances, stretcher bearers, or just soldiers walking themselves and making it back to the hospital.
Yeah, this is one of those situations where, because this is the first major battle of the war, there's not a lot of infrastructure that has yet been created for thinking through these kinds of things, thinking through how is a wounded soldier going to get to a hospital? Who is going to be the one responsible for bringing them back? And we see, the early forms of organization, things like the idea that musicians can be turned into stretcher bearers, and soldiers' comrades will help to bring them back to hospitals. But there's not really any firm plan yet for any of this on the Union or Confederate side during this battle. I have an image here I'm going to show. The Union Army did have ambulances available. I'm going to go to our share screen here again. Pardon my technical slowness. All right, there we go. Let's show an ambulance from 1861. Get away from William King. Show you what one of these ambulances would have looked like. So this is a photograph from the collections of the Library of Congress. This shows an ambulance from the U.S. Army. This is labeled as 1861. This is a fairly good representation of what a wagon that could have been turned into an ambulance. It is expressly labeled as such, as an ambulance in the Library of Congress collection. What you'll notice about this particular ambulance, and especially for those of you who have watched our other videos or have visited the National Museum of Civil War Medicine and seen photographs of ambulances from, say, 1863 or 1864, is that this is not a modern ambulance by any stretch of the imagination. This is really just a wagon that has been designated an ambulance. And the difference really was by 1862, 1863, and into the end of the war, ambulances had been designed by folks like William Hammond, who's going to go on to be the medical director, go on to be the Surgeon General of the U.S. Army, and Jonathan Letterman, who's going to be the medical director of the Army of the Potomac. One of the first things that they do is to design ambulances with suspension systems that are going to be able to kind of crude shock absorbers that are going to ease the passage for a wounded soldier in one of those horse-drawn ambulances. You'll notice on this particular wagon, you don't have that luxury. And so what that means is if you're one of the wounded who is unlucky enough to have to be transported in this, you're going to be bouncing along. Every bump is going to be agonizing. And this is actually better than some of the two-wheeled, as opposed to four-wheeled ambulances that were sometimes used by the U.S. Army and in the Confederate Army as well, that were nicknamed the Gut Busters, that they would bounce severely up and down over rutted roads. Many of these battles can be fought in Virginia, and Virginia roads were pretty notoriously, in many cases, bumpy and bouncy, especially in some of the mountainous regions of Virginia. just one more point to say on the ambulances here. U.S. Army is going to have its ambulances under the quartermaster department up until summer of 1862. And what that means is at the Battle of First Bull Run in July of 1861, ambulances are under the quartermaster department. Quartermaster department has much more of an interest of getting munitions to the front line, getting equipment needed by the soldiers at the front. They're much less concerned about the treatment and evacuation of the wounded. And so there's a disconnect between the medical department, which has the surgeons, and surgeons are with their units in many cases at the front, and they're going to be separated from the ambulances, and in some cases their equipment that they're going to need to get these wounded soldiers away from the front lines and back to medical attention. At this battle, there's very little forethought, very little pre-planning, and what that means is many of the ambulances, which were being largely driven by contractors, so they weren't even members of the U.S. Army. They're contractors, and some of them famously get into these stores of medicinal alcohol on their way to the battlefield, like you would, and they are never even going to arrive on the battlefield. They're going to turn around before they even get to the battle, as the battle turns away from the U.S. Army and the end of July 21st, 1861, and they're never even going to arrive on the battlefield. And so this battle, from the medical perspective for the U.S. Army, like it is from a military perspective, is a failure. And one of the big failures, and this is going to be a failure on future battlefields as well, is when it comes to these ambulances. Because at Manassas, at Bull Run, they never arrived, for the most part, at all on the battlefield. And this means there's going to be a lot of reforms that are going to need to go into place, and it's going to take a long time for them to really be borne out and really to think deeply about how they're going to reform, how they're going to make this system better and make it work. But First Bull Run's where they're going to realize we have a major problem here and we really need to start addressing it. It's going to take a long time, but this is going to be the start where they are going to begin to realize just the scope and the scale of what they're dealing with and how important battlefield evacuation is. Because what that results in for the Confederate Army, as Kevin talked about, we have a hospital, Craighill House Hospital, Ben Lomond, which is not that far away from the front lines. For the Union Army, for the U.S. Army, as they're retreating away, their wounded soldiers have a lot farther to go to get back safely to Union lines and to Union hospitals that are going to be established farther away from the battlefield, and there is no way to get those soldiers between the battlefield and those hospitals safely. So this is the situation on the federal side, on the Union side, that is going to be some of the issues that they're going to be facing. Kevin, I don't know if you have anything you might want to add there?
No, I think you pretty much covered the ambulances. That was the one big point I was going to make, was the Federal Army basically leaving a lot of their ambulances behind, like you said, in Alexandria and other points. So removing the wounded from the battlefield was not easy, and that meant that a lot of the Federal wounded fell into Confederate hands in the immediate aftermath of the battle. And again, just showing you, I think, the sort of the unpreparedness for war. The Confederate troops that were doing the capturing of some of these hospitals, they found that, they thought, we've captured Yankees, this is great. And they took anybody that they possibly could capture, including Union surgeons, and sent them to the rear. And then all of a sudden they realized, no, wait, that means we're responsible for taking care of all these wounded soldiers. And so very quickly that kind of set the precedent for surgeons being paroled, or at least treated a lot more fairly when it came to the prisoner of war situation later on in the war.
Yeah, that's a great point, and somebody that you mentioned earlier is going to play a really big role in that system being kind of thought out a little bit later in the conflict is Hunter McGuire up in Winchester, Virginia in the spring of 1862, almost getting to a year after First Bull Run. He is going to be thinking about this kind of situation. He's going to come into a large number of Union wounded that he has captured, and they need to really think about how they're going to deal with that. How are they going to deal with those non-combatants at that point, wounded soldiers, and the caregivers, the surgeons who are designated to help. So you have somebody who's present at First Bull Run in Hunter McGuire that a year later is still thinking about that and trying to systematize. And that's something that's really important and Kevin and I have talked about this, and Kevin's work on the hospitals at Shepherdstown as well gets into some of this, is there's a lot of having to come up with systems, having to create, because of the scale of this conflict, creating systems where no system previously existed, whether that's hospitals, whether that's an evacuation system, whether that's your ambulances. And the lack of those systems at Bull Run leads to a lot of the nightmarish situations that we see of wounded soldiers left out in the sun for days after the battle, some of those horror stories that we're going to see. Kevin, I want to go back to you here and see, if you have any particular stories that you think of from a medical perspective at Bull Run that you think kind of illustrate, the horrors of First Bull Run, some of the experiences of the wounded from this particular battle.
Yeah, of course, I'm most familiar with the wounded at Pringle House Hospital, so I'm going to draw another story from there. William Nelson was captain of the Clark County Company in the 2nd Virginia Infantry, and as Jake and I have talked about, as historians and as interpreters, you always wish that you could just find this one story that's so emblematic of a larger point that you wanted to hammer home for your visitors. And this one comes from Edward Craighill, but Nelson received a very grievous wound right in one of his lungs in the action on top of Henry Hill, and he was brought back to the Pringle House Hospital. And basically, Craighill was assigned to care for Nelson. And Craighill, again, 20 years old, he's fresh into all of this, almost brand new, basically takes a look at Nelson and says, well, there's not much we can do. And so basically just resigns him to death. But incredibly, because Craighill did nothing to help patch up Nelson's wound, Nelson actually survived, and he lived until, I believe, the 1890s. Much later on, but Craighill wrote in his memoirs that it was his own ignorance that saved Nelson's life, because Craighill wrote about later that if he had even known what the procedure was to care for a wound like that, which would have been to fill it up with patches and stop the bleeding and whatnot, Craighill, writing, of course, from a much more educated mindset when he's writing his memoirs, said that basically that would have given blood poisoning to Nelson by not allowing the wound to pus and to vent. And so really his ignorance, as he admitted later on, literally saved somebody's life. And I think that was a pretty common story for a lot of the surgeons there, that, again, they might be familiar with setting broken bones and injuries of that nature. But when it comes to shattered bones by mini balls, by bullets, and having to amputate limbs as quickly as possible and then moving on to the next and moving on to the next, this was something that a lot of those surgeons had never seen before, at least on that large of a scale.
Yeah, I believe the number I saw, the statistic I saw, is something on the order of about 90% of these surgeons who are going to participate in the Civil War had never treated a gunshot wound before they went into military service. So this is going to be a really new experience for a lot of these surgeons, North and South, who are going to be participating in these battles from the beginning in 1861. Is they're going to be thrown into these hellish hospital scenarios with very little training, with very little previous experience. And that means that a lot of mistakes are going to be made, or in this case, mistakes aren't going to be made because he's not even experienced to know enough what he's supposed to do. So, this is something where we oftentimes at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, we talk about, the myths of Civil War medicine. Kevin, I know you're familiar with a lot of these myths. One of them is just the inexperience and the lack of knowledge that these doctors had. And for the most part, we talk about how, and later on in the conflict, these surgeons are going to become some of the best in the world. But at these first early battles, they really are out in the wilderness, and they do not necessarily know what they are doing, and there are going to be situations where mistakes are going to be made. Now, one of the important things to say about that is one of the mistakes they're not making, by and large, is operating without anesthesia. And we got a great question from, I have to pull up her email here. We got a question in advance from Holly. Thank you, Holly. I hope you're listening, and you can hear our answer to this question. Holly asked a great question about, how did medical care how is it similar, and how is it different in 1861 from 1812, going back to 50 years before the Civil War? And one of the big differences between medicine and military medicine in the War of 1812 and military medicine during the Civil War is anesthesia. Surgeons, Union, Confederate, have access to chloroform and ether, and they have the knowledge, whether they experienced warfare before, whether they have ever treated a gunshot wound before, they have this knowledge that had filtered down through American medical communities that you operate under anesthesia, and chloroform and ether were available to these surgeons, and they are going to be using them in the vast majority of cases. And when we say vast majority, we mean 95% of cases, of surgical cases during the war, are going to be done under some form of anesthesia. And there are some famous examples where it isn't used, and then there are some injuries where you physically couldn't administer anesthesia. But by and large, even at these early battles, anesthetic is going to be used widely. It's going to be used at Ben Lomond, right? Right, Kevin?
Yes, yeah, we do actually have the last roster, basically, of the names of some of those soldiers that were there on August 25th, 1861. It was a report filed by Isaac Tanner. And cool thing is, on the backside, he actually gives a list of all of his medical supplies that he had with him. And he specifically mentions a couple different bottles of chloroform. Also a couple bottles of blackberry wine, which I haven't quite figured out what he was doing with those. But yes, he did have chloroform there, so they were definitely using it at the Pringle House Hospital.
So as we're beginning to start to draw to a close for this evening's program, Kevin, I kind of want to ask you to kind of step back, bigger picture. What do you think what are some of the important takeaways from a medical perspective from this first major land battle of the war at Bull Run in July of 1861?
One of them that I think is quite a large one is something I've already touched on, and Jake, you expanded on it, is the role that captured surgeons and medical personnel will play when they become prisoners of war. I think that really creates a unique dynamic when it comes to Civil War armies retreating and deciding to leave behind their wounded. I don't think there was much of a decision made at First Manassas when the Union Army was retreating. I don't think anybody said, well, we're just going to leave all these wounded behind. I think a lot of the surgeons, unfortunately, fled with them. But in later battles, you'll see that there is a conscious thought of leaving these wounded behind, in many cases knowing that they were going to be paroled and that their surgeons would be left behind, friendly surgeons would be left behind to care for these wounded. So, of course, I think what happens at Manassas really sets the groundwork for that, and it becomes a much more legitimate and structured way of dealing with wounded prisoners of war and finding care for them. That's not going to detract from an army taking care of its own men as well. And so I think that's a great way of being able to save as many lives as possible. Of course, if you think the Confederate Army is victorious on a battlefield and it's only going to take care, or it has to take care of its men and then also the men of the opposing army, then of course the ratio of wounded soldiers to surgeons is going to grow. But allowing friendly surgeons to remain on the field and to continue to care for their comrades is, I think, one of the biggest lessons that both sides learned from First Manassas.
Yeah, I would emphasize that 100%. You know, that is going to be an important issue that is going to be further systematized and talked about later on. But it is an early lesson that they are going to learn from that first major battle of the war. I'll just add in kind of my big takeaway from looking at this battle is when you look at it, it's this understanding that both sides are going to come to that this is going to be a longer conflict that is going to require us to take in the case of the Confederates, they don't have a system, so they need to create a medical department, they need to create the infrastructure, they need to create the hospitals, they need to get the ambulances, and I know many of them they're going to use are going to be taken from the Union Army over the course of the war. They need to build their own in some cases. They need to create evacuation systems as well. for the federal side, they need to get rid of their old system, the old medical department. The way that the medical department operated before the Civil War was to save as much money for the U.S. Army as possible. And that is not going to fly in a conflict that is escalating quickly, spinning out of control after First Manassas, and escalating very quickly. So this battle emphasizes how important, and the failures in this battle, to deal with the wounded soldiers, to deal with evacuating those soldiers off the battlefield, getting them away from the firing lines, getting them away off the battlefield to safety and to hospitals that are well designed to care for them, is going to be the takeaway for me, is that, we need to create this system. It is desperately needed. And if you don't create it, more and more soldiers are going to die, and their deaths are preventable. And the public knows that. And both Union and Confederate sides of this conflict are going to be dealing with public opinion. And medical care for soldiers is something that is always on the mind of the families on the home front. And it is a morale issue for the troops at the front lines. And so right here at the beginning of the conflict, we see that these armies need to address this. And this battle makes that crystal clear. All right, folks. So I'm going to go over to some of the questions that we've had. I know I've seen some questions already in the comment section, and thank you for adding those in. If you do have any further questions about this battle, about the medical care, whether we addressed it or not, please throw that into the comment section. We are happy to get to some of those questions. In the meantime, if you are here and watching and enjoying what you're seeing, please hit the like button, hit the share button, go on over, click the support button in the comment section. I commented earlier, and become a donor or a member for the National Museum of Civil War Medicine and support these videos. All right, so let's go into our questions here. This one is going to come from Barry Davis. We did get addressing this a little bit, but Barry says, did they have enough resources to transport wounded soldiers off the battlefield? Kevin, do you have any thoughts on that? I know we already kind of addressed this, but I wasn't sure if you had anything else to say on it.
Yeah, I would say, the real glaring issue is for the Federals of getting the wounded off the battlefield. When the retreat starts, so a lot of the surgeons, not all of them, but a lot of them, pretty much ditch their surgical kits and they make a run for it. And they join the rest of the Federal Army in retreat. Actually, the Confederate infrastructure of removing soldiers from the battlefield is not its finest moment, certainly. But if you look at what they do in the days and weeks afterwards, of course, the Confederates have they have the interior lines at this point. They have the infrastructure, being Manassas Junction, and so they are able to get a lot of their wounded away from the Manassas area to more general hospitals in Charlottesville. There's one in Warrenton as well. And so not immediately on the day of the battle, both sides aren't very effective at moving the wounded off the battlefield, but in the days and weeks afterwards, again, the Confederates probably get higher marks for that. And part of that is because they're right on a rail line, and they can move wounded further into the interior of Virginia.
Excellent. Thank you, Kevin. All right. This one's from our old pal, Robert Lustria. Hi, Robert. Hope you're doing well. He asks, and I do not know the answer to this. I'm not sure if, Kevin, if you might be able to help me out with this. Was there mistreatment of Federal wounded reported at First Bull Run? He adds in, as in bayoneting of Federal wounded or prisoners.
I think a lot of it was propaganda, I think in some respects, but there is a story of a soldier in the 14th Brooklyn, a private in his late 30s by the name of Lewis Francis, that was initially in the fighting for some of the Federal artillery pieces on Henry Hill. He was bayoneted in the knee, which I think would have to be a very painful wound. And so, of course, that pretty much incapacitated him, prevented him from moving off the battlefield. And by his own account, he was bayoneted at least 14 times on the battlefield as he lay there. Incredibly, none of those bayonet thrusts hit any vital organs, and Francis survived. He was carried off the field. He eventually had to have his right leg amputated, and then a second amputation took off his entire right leg at the hip. But he lived until the 1870s. So there are at least some instances of that happening. But I would imagine from what I've seen of both northern and southern newspapers in the immediate aftermath of First Manassas, both sides, I think, blew atrocities like that out of proportion as a way to rally support to their cause. But it did happen, at least in a few limited instances.
All right. Thank you, Kevin. This is next one. We've kind of addressed this one as well from Barry. Were gunshot wounds even a common thing for most doctors to treat?
Yeah, I've never heard that 90% statistic, but I'm going to start using that, Jake. I've always said it's probably a majority never have. If anything, it might be an accidental gunshot wound, really, that doctors are having to treat from hunting accidents or whatever it may be.
Yeah, the number that I saw cited came from I believe a federal surgeon who, writing after the war, estimated that it was around 90%. I'll get that. I'll get that figure specifically, and I'll put it up on our Facebook page in the days to come, because it's a fascinating statistic, and also being generated by a surgeon himself. So he has that firsthand experience with many of his colleagues, talking about never treating a gunshot wound. I will say, in the pre-war U.S. Army, it was common because of what the Army was doing before the Civil War. In many cases, they are out on the frontier, participating in many cases actions against American Indian tribes on the frontier. Civil War surgeons, many of them before becoming Civil War surgeons, if they had served in the military before, many of them had more experience treating arrow wounds than they had treating gunshot wounds. So that is something that is they had to deal with it out on the frontier, and so they're not going to have that experience that they need. Even though they may be trained military surgeons, they may not have actual first-hand experience of treating gunshot wounds. And I believe I have seen in my readings over the years, Kevin, that many of the soldiers at First Bull Run, many of them are still dealing with 69 caliber smoothbores. We got buck and ball and those sorts of things.
Yeah, mostly I think there are probably a few exceptions to that, but I think for the most part that seems accurate.
So the evolution of these, there will be an evolution in the wounds themselves. We're going to see the round ball musket balls being used at this stage of the war, or buck and ball, with basically turning these 69 caliber muskets into shotguns at close range. We're going to see that changing, and the weaponry actually changing and moving on to that conical ball, the mini ball that we always talk about, leading cause of amputations and those sorts of things as the war goes on. So there's going to be an escalation in terms of the actual wounds. They're going to become worse as the war goes on, and these surgeons are going to have to adapt to that. And that's going to be an experience they're going to have to gain in the operating room. There's only so much reading that these guys could do to train them up for the situations that they're going to face on the battlefield. Another question here from Lynn. This one's from Lynn Bristol. Lynn's a great supporter of the museum. Thanks for being here, Lynn. She asks, are the surgeons and or stewards assigned to the field hospitals you've mentioned, in addition to, I always mispronounce this, is it Portici? Portici?
I think so, yeah. That's how I've heard it pronounced, is Portici.
Portici. Yeah. At First Bull Run, making record accounts of surgeries, techniques, observations. Basically, are they keeping any kind of scientific information of the things that they are doing at these hospitals that you've mentioned?
I don't think anything. Yeah, I've never seen anything contemporary that they are, writing it down in the days and weeks afterwards. But the Confederate Medical Corps, which I've studied a bit more, so I'm sure the Federals did something similar. But the Confederate Medical Corps actually began a journal later on in the war, where surgeons were able to share their experiences, share their ideas, share what they've learned, and teach others about, some of these shared experiences. I've never seen any cases in those journals from Manassas specifically. Again, the best source that we have, at least at Lomond, or the Pringle House Hospital, is Craighill's Memoirs, and he was a hospital steward. Hunter McGuire lives until decades after the Civil War, and he writes pretty prolifically. about Stonewall Jackson's wound that he receives a wound in the hand on top of Henry Hill, and a few other things that McGuire mentions. He talks about the Confederate Field Hospital at Holcomb's Branch, things like that. But I've never really seen anybody that has kept detailed records. And I think that's to show again how unprepared both sides were. The Confederate medical records for 1861 are just a shambles and hardly organized at all. And we do know from other records that reference it that there is a roster somewhere out there of all the wounded soldiers that were taken back to the Pringle House Hospital, the types of wounds they were being treated for, things like that, but we've never been able to find it. And it's probably stored away somewhere in the National Archives at some point that we've been searching for. But I've never seen anything that really details every single wound that these surgeons are treating. But if anybody knows of any, I'd love to see it.
Yeah, that's kind of a similar situation on the federal side, on the U.S. Army side at this early stage of the war. Just kind of the chaotic nature of things means that there's not going to be a lot of great documentation that's going to come from later conflicts, later battles we're going to see. And by 1862, it's actually mandated that these surgeons are keeping records on these sorts of things, of how many wounds they're treating, what kind of wounds they're treating, how they're treating them. We see that with the establishment of the Army Medical Museum in 1862 as well, of actually a place designated to take on this information that's being recorded out in the field and translating that into data that actually can be analyzed and then can actually change what's going on out there in the field. And these kind of chaotic early war battles are going to, again, kind of point the medical leadership in the U.S. Army towards this. It's important to get an understanding of what's going on in these field hospitals, what kind of surgeries are going on, and what are their outcomes. Are these soldiers surviving? Are we doing enough amputations? Are treatments working? Are the medications working? And in some cases, they're not going to find any answers. But in other cases, they do actually change outcomes. Like one of the things that U.S. Army and medical department in their research is going to find is that, while amputations get a bad reputation and we think of them as this horrible, horrible thing, they actually save lives. And, the U.S. Army and many of its medical leaders realize that they're not doing enough amputations in these battlefield field hospitals. They could save more lives if they would do them more often. And those are the kinds of things that it's really important, as Lynn, in asking this question, it's important to keep these kinds of records because they are going to be able to inform subsequent surgeons or somebody that's new that might be coming in. They can learn from these lessons. And then years after the war, right up to the present day, Kevin and I can go into, maybe not so much with some of the Confederate records, but ideally we would be able to go into the National Archives and look at these documents and say, oh, this is what's going on. This is what they were doing, and these are the outcomes that they were finding. Those are really important. This is a really good question, Lynn. Thank you for asking it. It gets to kind of what Kevin and I, as historians doing work with Civil War medicine, these are the kinds of resources that we are always out there on the hunt for. All right, see here. I think that may be all of our questions, and it is. So thank you all so much for asking those questions this evening, and we're coming right up on an hour here. So we're going to wrap it up here. Kevin, I want to thank you so much for coming on with us this evening, and always appreciate your incredible knowledge and what you bring to the table as a young historian doing great work out there in the field. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And for you folks watching out there, if you enjoyed this conversation, you are going to love Ben Lomond. So if you have not been to that museum down on just off the Manassas battlefield, please go check that out. Kevin, what's your information about if anybody's interested in visiting?
Yeah, so we're open for tours right now. Thursday through Monday, we offer guided tours of the hospital exhibit at 11 a.m., 1 p.m., and 3 p.m. We do have some size restrictions, but really there's no need to book anything in advance if you just show up during one of those times. But to stay up to date, follow us on our website. It's pwcgov.org/history. And follow us on social media as well. We have Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube pages to follow also. So just look up Prince William County Historic Preservation Division or Ben Lomond Historic Site, and you'll find us.
Excellent, and I highly recommend going and taking a visit to Ben Lomond on your next trip to Manassas. Well, thank you all so much for watching with us this evening. Appreciate your viewership and your support. If you are liking these videos and enjoying what we have been doing at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, go up, click that like button, click that share button. If you haven't yet followed us here on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or YouTube, go ahead and do that. Our handle across the board, social media wise, is Civil War Med, and you can find us on any of those social media channels. And hope we will see you on the next video, which is coming up on Wednesday. My colleague Kyle Dalton will be talking about anesthesia in the Civil War, and very much looking forward to that. And if you haven't yet clicked on that link in the comment section, civilwarmed.org/support, consider becoming a donor or a member and supporting the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. This is Jake Wynn, Director of Interpretation for the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, signing off for the evening. Thank you all so much.